This is a veiled question about optimism, but do you think that human beings or society will be self-correcting? Do you think that, let's just say, in the derogatory form, wokeness will burn itself out, the radical left will eat its own? Do you think that the correction is inevitable, and that the real question is to limit the damage of the overreach? Or do you think that it's all going to go down if it's not stopped? It's going to take everything.
There are a lot of corrections, and some of them look like a less organized version of China, and some of them look like a more organized version of Afghanistan. And I don't think either of those corrections are what we're going for. I think that we're going to at some point figure out the answer. There's going to be a lot of damage, or there has already been a lot of damage. Yeah. And I'm not sure that you will call or that you will have the same conception of America by the end of it. That is to say, I think it'll fix itself eventually. I don't think this leads to an extinction event in any terms. Okay. But there's a lot of things that people are not willing to recognize are being put on the table. Not just free speech, but freedom of association, of quite frankly not living in either China or Afghanistan, right? If you actually look at the lives that people are living in those countries, then many things that you would assume as a default if you're an American are just not there. And I think that just looking at those two models gives you an understanding that there's a very far way to fall without losing, like, quote unquote civilization. Okay. But that falling that distance also is not a future that we want. Okay. And quite frankly, I don't know the exact kind of likelihoods, but I think it's more likely that we end up in worse China or better Afghanistan, slightly better Afghanistan, than we end up, for example, in a more optimistic branch, right? In a branch where there's a big political movement, we rally around it, we manage to restore common ground, restore truth and objectivity, and we end up relatively unscathed, as opposed to those two options, right? I think the option of actually, I have no clue which one is more likely between worse Afghanistan or worse China or better Afghanistan.
Could you describe either of those dystopias briefly?
Yeah. Well, worse China is like an authoritarian state that essentially monitors all of its citizens, that has strong enforcement of various opinions, but isn't completely like dictatorial-esque. Has a lot of top-down control, has very targeted technocratic rule from the top, and where people's liberties are restricted, those are mostly kind of hidden behind a curtain instead of like actively having a gun pointed at you, for example. Or slightly better Afghanistan is like a country that eventually goes to war with itself, that is extremely destabilized by outside forces, that has constant struggles over power. And I think the slightly better version of that would be that, but people are a bit wealthier.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So if you had like God power and you could craft a republic or craft from this point forward, you somehow had a magic machine that created the restitution of our republic, what would that look like? Ideally, what would you work for if you had any optimistic bone in your body?
Well, there are a lot of core principles that I would jump to at first, and many of them can be gamified, but I would certainly have a much broader definition of free speech, including on certain platforms. Quite frankly, I think that certain platforms should probably, at the very least, have a national or public alternative, which is actually like a really left-wing idea, but I think I think the right-wingers can be sold on it given the current situation. Yeah, a lot more
social
public
media.
Yeah, a lot more public infrastructure in terms of communications, I think, as well as in terms of things like banking, in terms of things like everything that's being manipulated now. That's kind of the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
That's just the sort of governance or media or not the media aspect of it actually, but the governing or infrastructure aspect of it. I think I would have a pretty similar democratic system with a bit of sortition involved, which is essentially instead of a lot of the administrative positions, the sort of appointees that you would have, essentially being being directly connected to the presidency. I think I would have a randomly selected group of people who pass a certain bar, for example, can pass a basic competency test. And then you pick a random group of people from that pool, and maybe the president chooses from those, or whatever executive position chooses from those, just as a function of making corruption much more difficult. Actually, this came up in a conversation between, I think, Cal Newport and Lex Fridman, where he talked about most computer science problems being in this class of most lower bounds, most upper bounds. Most upper bounds of computer science problems tend to be very fragile. So what that means is that the kind of worst case scenario for how long will it take to solve this problem are usually very easily interfered with by just changing like a small amount of the data, right? And so I have this philosophy in government that is quite similar, of adding random noise functions to mess with people who want corruption, of adding just ways to insert tiny amounts of randomness that reduce the overall performance of a given role, of a given kind of bureaucracy or a given government function by a very small amount, but can make it much more difficult to corrupt.
Yeah,
and I think I would have like something that looks mostly like America, but with very inconspicuous noise functions put into various places.
I think that's a really smart idea, and it reminds me of one of those Greek city-states had a kind of a circular rotation of everybody who was a landowner, everybody who was a voter, qualified to be a citizen, so-called, would come up to some sort of officiating capacity several times in their life. There was just this lottery going on where they shared responsibility. If we could do that even on the local level, conscript experts to solve problems in a way, maybe even like package that in with student loan forgiveness, where we'll clear your we'll pay for your degree, but you have to serve. Yeah,
you're being paid in credit, or being paid in money, or for debt forgiveness for doing public service, which I think you should be paid for, right? So yeah, that's certainly something that is very interesting.
So